Good morning, everyone. I'm Paul Smedberg, Chair of the WMATA Board, and welcome to our November 4th, 2021 special board meeting. Before we begin this morning, I'd like to ask Metro's Assistant Chief Safety Officer, Jamie Johnson, to provide us with this morning's safety contact. Mr. Johnson.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair, fellow board members. So deer strikes are a hazard faced by our train operators throughout the year, but are especially common during mating season at this time of year. There have been 23 deer strikes on Metro trains since July, which is significantly more than the same period over the last few years. They tend to occur on the outer parts of the system, of course, most commonly in the early morning. And each strike causes, on average, 11-minute delay to passengers and can cause damage to rail cars. The Chief Operating Officer, Joe Leader, leads actions to mitigate this risk every year, and this year is no exception, with targeted inspections of fencing to secure the right of way, briefings to warn staff and explain the required actions in case of a deer strike, and post-incident examination of rail cars to ensure they are safe to run in normal service. But of course, all of us who drive, the public, board members and colleagues, especially bus operators and Metro Access drivers, also face deer strikes as a hazard on our roads, with over half the 1.9 million claims each year in the US occurring in the last 3 months of the year. So when driving, here are 3 tips. The first is to pay special attention at dawn and dusk when deer are most active. If you see one deer, there are likely more. Number 2, slow down. Use your headlights to keep an eye out for the reflection of their eyes. And number 3, stay in the center of the road, and it's safer to brake rather than swerve. That concludes the safety content. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Ms. Ellison, would you please call the roll?
Chair Smedberg.
Present.
Vice Chair Babers.
Present.
Vice Chair Slater.
Present.
Director Klein.
Present.
Director Letourneau.
Present.
Director Drummer.
Present.
And Director Martin Proctor. Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Ellison. First, we have the approval of the agenda. If there are no objections, I'd like to consider the agenda approved as presented. Are there any objections? Okay, hearing none, the agenda is approved as presented. Our item this morning is swearing in of a new board member. I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming the Metro Board, to the Metro Board, Dr. Tracy Lowe as the new principal member from the District of Columbia. She is a fellow with the Ann T. and Robert M. Case Center for Transformative Placemaking at Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. Prior to joining Brookings, Dr. Lowe was Senior Data Scientist at the Center for Real Estate and Urban Analysis at the George Washington University School of Business. She was previously Director of Research at the Rails to Trails Conservancy. Dr. Lowe is a graduate of DC Public Schools and holds a PhD in City and Regional Planning from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In addition to her research interest in placemaking, she served 2 years representing Ward 1 on the Mount Rainier City Council in Prince George's County, Maryland. She is currently a member of the Board of Directors of Greater Washington. Dr. Lowe, welcome. And now would you please raise your right hand so I may formally swear you into your new role. Please repeat after me. I, please state your name.
I, Tracy Haddon Lowe,
Do hereby solemnly swear
do hereby solemnly swear
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution and the laws of the District of Columbia,
and the Constitution and the laws of the District of Columbia,
from which I was appointed as a principal director
from which I was appointed as a principal director
of the Board of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority,
of the Board of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority,
and will faithfully discharge the duties of the office
and will faithfully discharge the duties of the office
upon which I am about to enter.
upon which I am about to enter.
Thank you, and welcome again, albeit over the computer. But would you like to say a few words?
This is an unexpectedly busy time to be joining the WMATA board, and I am honored to be able to jump into the deep end with you all at this time to do our best to manage this system. And I am particularly delighted to be able to represent the interests of my hometown, the place where I was raised.
Great. Well, welcome. We really look forward to working with you. Next, we'll move on to the approval of the revised committee assignments. With the new principal member appointed to the board, we need to revise the board's committee assignments. Therefore, I move that Tracy Lowe be appointed as a member of the Safety and Operations Committee. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Deputy Mayor Babers. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, Ms. Ellison, please call the roll.
Chair Smedberg,
Aye.
Vice Chair Babers,
Aye.
Vice Chair Slater,
Aye.
Ms. Klein,
Aye.
Mr. Letourneau,
Aye.
Dr. Lowe,
Aye.
Mr. Drummer,
Aye.
Ms. Martin Proctor. Mr. Chair, the motion passes.
Thank you. So we have no further business before the board right now, so we will stand adjourned. And before we move to the Finance and Capital Committee meeting, I'd like to ask the General Manager, Paul Wiedefeld. Mr. Wiedefeld will be giving us an update on the submission of the test plan for the 7000 series cars. Mr. Wiedefeld, good morning.
Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Dr. Lowe. Looking forward to working with you. And thank you for taking on this challenging position. Before I introduce the fiscal year 23 budget proposal, I did want to update the board on the work that's underway to return the 7000 series rail car safely to passenger service. After a process of consultation with the WMSC over the last few weeks, today we will formally submit a test plan to the Safety Commission for its review. The test plan will allow us to take the data that we have and verify it with the actual experiences. As the plan is considered by the WMSC, our team will begin setting up rail cars and inspection stations at Greenbelt to implement the test. I will update the board as we get feedback from the plan from the Safety Commission, and hopefully we'll be doing that very shortly.
So I guess one question, Mr. Wiedefeld, is, how long will it take the WMSC to review and approve this plan?
That'll be up to them. Again, I think the philosophy we've all been following during this whole process is not to set dates and then try to aim for a date, but rather let's make sure it's safe, and that will determine the date. So I think they have the same philosophy we do. So I think they'll, as soon as they feel comfortable, I think they will get back to us. And I think that's for the better for all of us.
Okay. All right. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? Well, we really appreciate that update, Paul. Thank you very much, because it is important.
It's an important milestone. I mean,
yeah, that we get those cars out there as quickly as possible, but that it's done in a safe and logical way. So, okay, Matt, Mr. Letourneau, we'll turn the meeting over to you for the Finance Committee meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Wiedefeld. Good morning and welcome to the November 4th Finance and Capital Committee meeting. Our first order of business this morning is to approve our agenda. If there are no objections, we'll consider the agenda approved as presented. Are there any objections by members of the committee to the agenda? Hearing none, the agenda is approved. Now on to our minutes. We have the minutes of our October 28th meeting and an executive session of the committee from October 14th. Are there any objections to the minutes as presented? Hearing none, we'll consider the minutes approved as presented. We only have one item on our agenda this morning, but it is a really major one. Mr. Wiedefeld and his team will be presenting his proposed FY 2023 operating budget and capital improvement plan. This will be the board's official look, first official look at the general manager's budget, and it's the beginning of a months-long process for us as we consult with our riders, with our jurisdictional partners, with each other, and work through this whole process that will conclude in the spring of next year. So I look forward to getting underway with this. There's a lot of important stuff in the budget this year. It's a particularly challenging time for us, as you all know, and as will become clear as we work through the slides and look at the numbers. And we certainly have our work cut out for us. Mr. Wiedefeld, I will turn it over to you and let your team get started.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we all know, this budget proposal continues to be out of the ordinary relative to the historic practice of budget development as we continue to navigate and support the region's recovery emerging from the pandemic. In the fiscal year 23 budget, total operating expenses are projected to be approximately $2.3 billion, with $1.9 billion in subsidy from the funding jurisdictions, roughly $715 million from the Federal Relief Act, and with the remainder coming through various revenue sources. Fair revenue assumptions are based on what we know from public and private sector employers and from our customers regarding return to work sites and changing travel behavior. The budget assumes a 53% of pre-pandemic ridership in fiscal year 23. But as we have done since the beginning of the pandemic, we will be closely monitoring the actual ridership trends we see over the next several months and reporting those to the board as we move through the budget process, as the chairman just mentioned, over the next several months. It is important to note that we are sustaining bus and rail service at current service levels to support the region's recovery, and that we are not recommending layoffs in order to support this level of service, and also to be consistent with the intent of the federal pandemic funds that we are receiving. Also, there's a special pandemic fare package proposed for consideration by the board that would take the conversations that the board has been having over the last few months about incentivizing riders to return and allow us to test those ideas with customers through public outreach before the board decides in the spring which of those might be the most attractive. Our capital improvement program, just coincidentally, is also $2.3 billion this year. It continues to focus on the safety, state of good repair, and reliability initiatives that we have underway, which maximizes federal dollars and the dedicated funds to reduce the backlogs of needs that we have. So now we'll turn it over to Dennis Anasik, our CFO, and Tom Webster, the head of capital program, to get in more details of the budget, and we'll be glad to take any questions that you may have. Dennis?
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, Chairman Lotano and members of the committee. My name is Dennis Anosike, Chief Financial Officer for Metro. As the General Manager just alluded to, ridership will be a key factor in Metro's operating budget for next fiscal year. But if we go to the next slide, the proposed budget before the committee today maintains Metro's focus on providing safe, reliable, and affordable transit services for riders. If you see on the next slide, you see that the board authorized improved services along with a set of pandemic fare discounts to ensure frequent, reliable all-day service to help bring back riders to the system. If you start with the box on the left, Metro Rail is funded to provide frequent all-day train service with 6-minute headways on the red line and 12-minute headways on other lines. In the middle box, it shows that there's 36 Metro bus lines that are operating 12 to 20-minute frequencies, along with restored or improved service on 69 other bus routes. And finally, the box on the right shows resources in the proposed operating budget to meet recovering demand for paratransit services. As the General Manager indicated, these services maintains current levels of service on the street as we go into the new year. On slide 6, last month, the committee will recall that we reviewed 2 ridership scenarios with the committee to help determine which option should guide Metro's FY 2023 budget development. And as the General Manager just noted, uncertainties around COVID-19 and its ongoing impact on ridership and revenue continue to shape Metro's fiscal year 2023 operating budget proposal. So the proposed budget assumes that ridership will reach about 167 million trips next fiscal year, which translates to 53% of pre-pandemic trip recovery. 52% of those trips, or 86 million trips, are expected to be on Metro Rail, 48% on Metro Bus, and the remaining 1%, or about 1.4 million trips, on Metro Access. And if you look on that trajectory, you'll see that anticipated ridership under this scenario will reach 65% of pre-COVID levels in fiscal year 2024 and reach 75% of pre-COVID level in fiscal year 2025. Slide 8 describes 3 initiatives that were part of Metro's effort to increase ridership and improve system revenue in fiscal year 2023. The first initiative, started on the left side of the slide, will enhance service equity using funds already designated for that purpose by the board. The board will consider specific service equity investments as part of Silver Line Phase 2 revenue service initiation later this fiscal year. The second initiative, reflected in the middle box, which I will discuss further on the next slide, is an additional set of pandemic fare discounts to help bring customers back to riding Metro again. And the last initiative is actually a continuation of Metro's ongoing efforts to hold costs down. Next fiscal year, the general manager will seek to achieve an additional $5 million in operating budget savings, along with, on top of efforts that have been taken in prior years to reduce operating costs at Metro. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the proposed budget includes 4 additional pandemic fare recommendations for the committee, including a flat $2 late night fare for one-way trips on Metro Rail to support late night workers and the late night economy. Metro will also discount, or is also proposing to discount, the 7-day pass as well as the monthly pass to make them more attractive to workers who are commuting less frequently today than they were previously. Finally, customers who ride the system using Metro's actual or mobile store value cards will get a $5 bonus for every $25 loaded on their Metro card. I should note that the last 2 discounts, the 7-day pass as well as the add value discount, are priced for 6 months. But in the aggregate, these discounts will benefit about 24 million riders and reduce revenue by about $11 million. So based on the ridership scenario that I discussed on slide 6, passenger revenue is projected at $304 million in fiscal year 2023, an increase of about $145 million over the previous year, before proposed fare discounts are factored in. With the proposed discounts, projected passenger revenues reduced to $293 million for the next fiscal year. In the same vein, projected non-fare revenue is expected to reach $82 million compared to $68 million budgeted in fiscal year 2022. The primary drivers in this category, again, is advertising and parking revenue. And on slide 12, Metro is projecting total operating revenue of $375 million in fiscal year 2023 and $465 million in fiscal year 2024. Amounts that are between $300 and $400 million below pre-pandemic levels. The next two slides focus on Metro's projected operating expenses and the additional cost drivers leading to Metro's upcoming fiscal year. So in total, Metro's proposed budget will increase by $182 million over fiscal year 2022. The slide lays out the major costs that are increasing Metro's fiscal year 2023 operating budget, starting with contractual obligations for bargaining unit employees, as well as pay for performance for other employees, shown in the top left quadrant of this particular slide. Next to that is Silver Line Revenue Service and Potomac Yard, which will impact the budget in a similar fashion. For Silver Line Phase 2, this funding restores amounts that were reduced in the current fiscal year due to project delay. The next three categories, inflation, additional support costs, and position restorations, include cyber protection enhancements and restoring positions that were frozen to help balance the current operating budget. However, as part of management's effort to reduce costs, staff will look for additional ways to minimize the number of frozen positions that will be restored to reduce the projected cost increases. The last category of cost in this shows that additional initiatives in response to WMSC directives, and in this case, safety management system implementation, will require additional funding. On slide 15, we show that overall Metro is projected to spend $2.3 billion next year and projected to spend $2.4 billion in fiscal year 2024. Based on projected revenues of $374 or almost $375 million, operating expenses of $2.3 billion, and subsidy of $1.2 billion, Metro faced a $760 million funding gap in 2023. The proposed budget closes this gap using $760 million of federal relief funding that's currently available to Metro. Slide 17 shows total federal relief funding retained by Metro and their utilization by fiscal year. As of the current fiscal year, just 2022, Metro has budgeted $1.6 billion of the $2.5 billion available to maintain service and retain employees, with $867 million currently available for Metro. And as I noted a second ago, $760 million of this balance will be allocated to fiscal year 2023, leaving about $151 million, and any other unused balance from the current fiscal year to support future fiscal years. The slide shows preliminary subsidy allocations to funding jurisdictions based on the general manager's recommended budget. The base subsidy growth, which is shown in the third column, is consistent with the mandated 3% growth cap. And the subsidy exclusions in the fifth column includes the Juneteenth holiday, safety initiatives that we just described, as well as the new services tied to both Silver Line and Potomac Air Station. On this slide, we've listed a couple of risks that could potentially impact Metro's budget in the next fiscal year. I will note, though, that the additional safety-directed investments and the growing cost of operating and capital maintenance for assets are perhaps the most significant ones on this list. With that, I will turn the presentation over to Tom to discuss the capital improvement program. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. My name is Tom Webster, Executive Vice President for Strategy Planning Program Management. The purpose of this part of the presentation this morning is to present the proposed capital program, the 6-year program, the capital budget expenditure forecast for FY23, and to review at a high level the 10-year capital plan. So Metro's capital program continues our focus on improving system safety, state of good repair, and reliability, and consists largely of projects and programs to rehabilitate, replace, and modernize the rail, bus, and paratransit systems. We're still working to integrate both resilience and sustainability into projects and programs, and of course, accelerating the delivery of projects to address important and overdue needs. We're also maintaining fiscal accountability in the program and our commitments to the region, including the 3% cap on increases in jurisdictional capital assistance, and continuing to leverage dedicated funding to support debt to support the capital program. The capital program is structured around a 10-year capital plan that looks out over the 10-year period at capital needs that should be addressed during that time period, and that plan is financially unconstrained. The 6-year capital program focuses on those projects and programs that are either ongoing already or starting during the 6-year, plan to start during the 6-year period. And then our 1-year capital budget is essentially the expenditure forecast for capital projects and programs for next fiscal year. Our capital investments are programmed into 6 investment categories and for both planning and for communication purposes: rail cars, rail systems, track and structures, stations, bus and bus facilities, and paratransit, and then finally operations and business support. In our rail cars and railcar facilities category, we're planning to invest approximately $2.4 billion over the 6-year period and about $300 million in FY23. And most of those investments are going towards the acquisition of new 8,000 series rail cars to replace the 2,000 and 3,000 series cars, as well as our continuing rail car rehabilitation, maintenance, and safety programs. And then on the facility side, the new heavy rail repair and overhaul facility, as well as continuing rehabilitation and replacement work at other rail yards and rail facilities. In our rail systems category, $1.7 billion is planned for the 6-year period and about $200 million for FY23. The focus in this category, again, rehabilitation and replacement of train control systems, as well as power that supports the rail system, and communications and emergency communication systems. In our track and structures program, $1.8 billion is planned for the 6-year period and about $460 million for FY23. The focus here remains on maintaining and rehabilitating our track and the associated infrastructure there, and then substantial new investments in the state of good repair, rehabilitation, and replacement of tunnels, bridges, structures, and other heavy infrastructure across the rail system. Our stations and passenger facilities program, $2.7 billion planned for the 6-year period, and just over $500 million in FY23. Focus here on, again, continuing fire life safety improvements, our annual programs for the rehabilitation and replacement of elevators, escalators, our continuing platform rehabilitation program, as well as a lot of the back end, not immediately visible to customers, systems that support station. In bus facilities and paratransit, 2.3 billion planned for the 6-year period, and about 440 million for the FY23. Continuing our bus acquisition program to replace and paratransit acquisition program to replace vehicles reaching the end of useful life, as well as our bus rehabilitation and maintenance programs. And we're also underway with our electric bus acquisition, test, and evaluation program. The facility side, we're moving ahead with the replacement of Northern and Bladensburg garages, and have programmed those facilities for electric buses. We're continuing rehabilitation at other bus facilities across the system and beginning the planning for the eventual replacement of Western Bus Garage. Also on the customer-facing side, moving ahead with our Metro Bus shelter replacement program, as well as a series of customer information improvements, including some digital signs, and importantly, partnering with the jurisdictions on our bus priority programs, including supporting efforts on dedicated lanes, as well as queue jumps, transit signal priority, and other efforts to improve bus. In operations and business support, during the 6-year period, we will be completing the office consolidation projects in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, as well as the relocation and setup of our new data center, continuing the hardware and software investments necessary to support operations, and as well as business and financial operations at Metro, and then continuing again more of those state of good repair programs to keep the service vehicle fleet in a state of good repair, as well as roofs across Metro's facilities, and staying up to date with our environmental compliance requirements as we move forward into the next 6 years. So I think just briefly, a reminder here about the focus of our program. Regional and federal investment has helped tremendously to address overdue needs and to establish programs to sustain safety and state of good repair. So we've made quite a bit of progress in areas including track rehabilitation and others. We have much more work to do to catch up, particularly in areas such as structures, the bridges, platforms, and tunnels I mentioned earlier, some of the key systems that support rail and bus, as well as the facilities that store and maintain our vehicles. So those recurring and cyclical maintenance and rehabilitation programs have been established with the support of that sustained jurisdictional and federal investment, and it allows us to again sustain the state of good repair of the system moving forward. So in summary here, our overall 10-year financially unconstrained plan is 23 billion. The proposed 6-year capital program is 12.4 billion, and the capital budget forecast for next year is 2.3 billion. This shows the forecasted trajectory of investment over the 6-year period, and then in the 10-year period, the approximate level of investment we believe is necessary to again sustain safety, state of good repair, and to modernize the system. On the left-hand side of this slide, we summarize those 6 investment categories and the investment plan for FY23, the 5 years after that, in the 6-year total, and then display the estimate of debt service that is required to support that level of investment over the 6-year period. On the right-hand side is a breakdown of projected funding allocated among our jurisdictions, our anticipated federal grants for FY23 and an estimate for the 6-year period, as well as forecasts for reimbursable projects and the debt issuance to support the FY23 capital program. From a state of good repair, backlog, and overdue needs standpoint, Metro has done estimates over the past few years of overdue work and the size of that backlog by investment need and planning category. In 2016, we estimated that backlog at about $7 billion. At the end of 2018, that had been reduced as a result of significant investment to about $5 billion. If the capital program as proposed is implemented and the current 6-year program continues as planned, we estimate that backlog will be reduced to roughly $3.2 billion at the end of FY27. And then at the end of the FY 2031 time period, and again, this is a financially unconstrained projection, but we estimate that backlog of overdue investment needs will be about $1 billion. So like in the operating budget, as Dennis discussed, there are some risks, opportunities, and other considerations for discussion and to keep in mind as the board moves forward with consideration of the capital program. We are experiencing, as most are, some supply chain delays still related to the pandemic. We're anticipating the impacts of inflation, and we are also experiencing cost increases associated with construction market changes. On the capital funding side, again, opportunities and some uncertainty, pre-reauthorization, the opportunity of potential federal infrastructure funding to support some of our transformational needs, and then long-term, the capacity of dedicated funding to continue to support the program. We're always very cognizant of potential emergency safety requirements and emerging state of good repair needs, and anticipate that there may need to be amendments or revisions to the program as those things develop. And then, of course, we have, as I mentioned, these transformational opportunities that long-term remain largely underfunded or unfunded, including, again, long-term sustaining our state of good repair programs, rehabilitation, maintenance, and replacement programs, our zero emission vehicle programs, and the board's goals to have a fully zero emission fleet by 2045, the modernization of our rail signaling system, as well as capacity improvements across the rail system, additional 8-car trains, and the infrastructure that's necessary to support that. And then finally, just a reminder about the schedule. So today is the general manager's proposed budget. Next month, we will be seeking authorization for public hearings and the public participation process. Those will follow in January, February, along with the board's deliberations and discussions. And then budget adoption is scheduled for March. And the reason, or a few reasons that's important, it allows us to timely submit our federal grant applications for FTA funding, as well as prepare for the implementation of any fare and service changes that the board approves by the beginning of the fiscal year. So, Mr. Chairman, that concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Webster, Mr. Anasike, for this presentation. I'll open it up to questions in a minute, but maybe just wanted to kind of frame it a little bit. If you go back to slide 16, which was in the operating section, that kind of shows us the application of the FY23 federal relief funds. And it's showing that we're applying $715.8 million to the FY23 budget, with the remainder of $151 million in 24. This scenario for 23 is assuming 53% ridership, correct?
Yes. Yes.
So if that, for some reason, and I hope it does, but for some reason, if that did not materialize, then we would have to dip further into the federal relief in all likelihood to make up that difference, right?
Yes. Or it could go the other way.
It could. I hope it does.
Yeah.
But one, you don't have to tell me now and you wouldn't be able to, but one thing I'm curious about is what level of ridership would cause us to have to spend down the remainder of the federal relief? You know, in other words, if ridership only hit 45% or something like that, would that mean we'd spend the rest of the 150 million and then potentially run into a problem without having funding available? So for a future meeting, I'd be interested to see if you could do that calculation. And then maybe just a general sort of framing question. And the board essentially has, and you have a choice here, which is to try to slow down the spend of the federal relief, knowing that we have a significant gap in FY24, or for us to essentially continue providing the level of service that I think the region wants and that we want to provide, but the implication is down the road, we may just simply run out of money. So in a way, this is kind of a bit of a leap of faith. And I think as we go into this process, it needs to be really clear. I think it's been clear for us on the board, but to our external partners, it needs to be crystal clear that if we proceed with this type of budget, moving into 23, providing the level of service that I think people want us to provide, we will run into a significant budget gap in FY24, and we are going to need more help from sources. Would you agree with that?
I would. The only other thing I would just bring everyone's attention is, in effect, if we were to slow down that burn rate, as you know, the vast majority of our expenses are on labor. That would mean obviously layoffs, and the federal relief money that we have. I mean, that was the intent, and explicitly that is not to occur. That's why you're getting the dollars to help support the economy by having those people employed. So that would be the balance we'd have to work through.
Okay, thanks. I may have some more questions, but let me open it up to, first we'll go to members of the committee and then the rest of the board. If you want to use the hand feature on Teams, so I can call on you. Okay, Ms. Babers.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Paul, Dennis, and Tom for a very thoughtful presentation. Budgets are always quite difficult. I do have a lot of questions, but I'm gonna keep them, try to just pull out ones that I definitely want to know the answer to. So, and somehow it looks like maybe my slide numbers from reviewing the presentation in advance didn't quite line up. I hope I'm right. So on slide 17, I think it's okay, well, even if it's not. So whatever happened to our discussion on whether or not bus rail transfers would remain free? Because as you know, that's a big, that's a key thing that the district is interested in. And just logically, it seems like once you get on either a bus or a metro rail to go to wherever it is you're going to, you should expect to pay whatever that fare is when you first get on. And even if you have to transfer through maybe no fault of your own, but that's the only way you can get there is you have to transfer to either bus or rail. It just seems like we penalize people for the fact that Metro doesn't provide service all the way through, whether it's when they get on the bus or whether they get on the Metro rail. So what was our consideration for that for this particular budget?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Davis. The general manager's recommended budget builds on those initial pre-pandemic fare reductions that the board and the committee and the board approved. So the free transfers that you're referring to is subsumed in this budget proposal. So it will still be free for customers who are riding next fiscal year.
Okay, great, because I thought I saw something that said something about $2 transfer fee.
No, what this budget includes is a $2 flat late night fee on Metro Rail, but the free transfers remains in effect for next fiscal year.
Okay, great. So now let's move on to the 4 fare reduction initiatives that this budget includes. Was I correct to see that we're only talking about this for 6 months? As it says something about for 6 months?
So you are correct that some of the proposals are for 6 months only, subject to the committee and the board's preference. And on this slide 9, it shows that the 7-day unlimited pass and the add value bonus are the components that are for 6 months. The other ones are zoomed for the entire year. And at least that's the recommendation from the general manager, subject to the committee's decision.
Okay, so one of the decisions that we need to make as a board is whether or not we agree with the 6 months or whether we want to maybe see it for the whole year, which would change, of course, the revenue impact.
That is correct.
And if I may just add, part of the discussion there was with the changing travel behavior, it was like, what should we do now? And as we get a better handle of what the travel behavior is like, that was sort of the rationale of doing it for 6 months.
Okay, all right. And then I'll just have my last question, just making sure. Are we purchasing electric vehicles for our Metro Access fleet? Or are we kind of aligning the electrification of those Metro Access vehicles similar to our bus?
Thank you for the question. We are beginning an exploration of purchasing electric vehicles also for the Metro Access fleet, sort of concurrent with that test and evaluation program for bus.
Okay. All right.
We have not yet purchased electric vehicles though for Metro Access.
Oh, okay. So we have 0 electric Metro Access fleet.
I believe that's correct. Yes.
Okay. And then I'm gonna sneak one more question in real quick. What type of positions are currently frozen or vacated that equals that 20.9 million? I think that was.
That's correct. The positions in addition, in order to help balance the current fiscal year's budget, the general manager's direction across the organization was let's do our part and focus on back office operations for the most positions for the most part. So most of those are what you're seeing. He has excluded all safety sensitive positions, including bus operators, rail operators, safety, and some maintenance positions. But it's about 1,000 positions that are frozen to help save money for the year. And the goal is to obviously restore some of those positions, given the restoration of service in the field, but to do so in a way that will hopefully continue to generate some savings going forward.
Okay, because since we know we're going to have a fiscal cliff in FY 24, I was just wondering and thinking, should we take another look at some of those positions as a board and determine whether or not some of them need to remain frozen? Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Slater.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Just maybe a couple of questions. I'll start kind of on the position side as Deputy Mayor Rabers did. There are 2 kind of thoughts here I want to understand a little bit more detail about. So, some of the positions, there's 21 new positions, it looks like, based on WMSC safety mandates. I'd like to kind of understand which mandates they were and kind of what those positions look like. And then I would like to understand the restoration of the vacant and frozen positions and exactly what those positions are, kind of what the priority is in kind of bringing those back. So maybe I'll kind of pause and see if you had any thoughts on both of those.
Thank you, Secretary Slater. Yes, the additional positions which are tied to the WMSC directives, my understanding is that those are related to the safety management systems, which I believe the safety committee was briefed on a week or so ago. And so what we our strategy is that to make sure that we are fully funding all directives from WMSC and all needs directed towards safety. And so we can provide you the details of those positions and their composition. With respect to the restoration of positions, again, we have a list of those positions also. And as I indicated to the committee last time, is that we're now engaged in a process of trying to determine which one of those should be restored. But we recognize that most of those will be needed in light of the level of service that's back on the street. But that information can be made available to the committee also. Great.
Thank you, Mr. Ansiki. One thing I would ask is, as I look at kind of the legislative exclusions, I really like it if WMATA's legal counsel can kind of connect with our legal counsel and our Attorney General's office and just make sure that we all kind of agree on those, because that law is pretty new. So I just want to make sure that we're all kind of looking at that in terms of agreement on those exclusions. So just kind of some coordination. I think they work pretty well together. So I'd like to ask that. And then just kind of two questions remaining. One is kind of getting back to about 95% of the pre-pandemic service. Are we at all concerned about being able to do that with the amount of bus operator vacancies that we're all kind of facing right now?
Mr. Secretary, this is Paul Wiedefeld. Yes, that is a concern. As I'm sure you're experiencing up in the Baltimore system. Yeah. It also plays out on the Metro Access side as well. It is an industry-wide issue, yeah. And definitely one in this region. So that is an issue that we're watching very carefully. We may have to do some things to deal with that in the very near future to address that. We had to do it, unfortunately, on some of the bus routes that we just announced that we had to pull back a bit. And that's what's driving that. And it's a challenge for us. I mean, there's no doubt about it. So we will work through that. But that is something that is, week to week, almost month to month right now, that could have an impact on us. And I'll be discussing that a little bit further with the board in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely. We're facing the exact same issue on our Baltimore system, both with Metro Access and our core bus, and the ability to kind of hire, plus the amount of operators that we have that may be in quarantine, or maybe their children are kind of being sent home, and that ability to kind of staff up has really kind of concerned us. And then kind of the last thing is not necessarily a question, just more of a comment. Like Chair Letourneau and Deputy Mayor Babers, I am kind of a little bit concerned about 2024 and how we're going to address that. I'm probably more concerned about 2025 because that number just kind of grows a little bit. And so I think we're going to have some future discussions on how we're going to address that as a region and how we can plan for that. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Slater. Ms. Klein.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This was a really great presentation. I have a couple of questions about it. First off, on the capital side, how are you accounting for the potential that there is a significant new influx of federal capital dollars if the pending legislation passes? I mean, I know that's not reflected in these budgets, but if it does pass, and it's a fairly significant increase that's proposed, about 35% or so in the basic formula programs for transit, how would that be handled?
So, thank you, Director Klein. Two factors here. One is, we do have, as I mentioned during the presentation, some fairly significant underfunded needs over the 10-year period. So we would certainly look to that. And then depending on exactly where the federal dollars come and what the eligible uses are. We would essentially rebalance and sort of reschedule the program based on eligibility and other things.
And if that funding, if the bills were to pass in December and say the funds were available starting in March or so, would that, I guess that would be probably reflected in the fiscal 24 budget?
Primarily, yes, and again, depending on exactly how this plays out, there could be other adjustments that happen, but generally we're because our fiscal year is different than the federal fiscal year, we're a little bit off cycle with how that works. So it would be more of a FY24 issue. Yeah.
Thank you. Going back to the operating budget, or actually the overall initiatives, the first one that was on the left on that slide related to equity and increasing equitable access. I know there was some funding reserved for increasing equitable access to the system in the coming year, and I know that there's not a lot of detail about that. Can you say anything at this time about what that initiative might include?
Actually, I'll turn that over to Tom.
Yeah, Director Klein, again, thank you. At this point in time, this is largely a placeholder for future adjustments, and we will be bringing forward some potential service improvements that would utilize that placeholder funding.
Okay, all right, great. I look forward to seeing those. And then the last thing I wanted to just comment on is related to the fare proposals. I think that there's certainly some benefit to discounting the passes, making them more flexible for people whose work schedules have changed. The one concern I have in resting kind of so much of our fare policy proposals on passes and the add value bonus is that that's going to skew the benefits towards people who can afford to pay up front, either for a monthly pass or a weekly pass, or to add that $25 in value all at once. And I think we should continue to think as a board of how we can ensure that folks who don't have that $25 to add all at once can still benefit and be induced to take more trips on the system. I know that we could ultimately, hopefully, we'll be able to put in a system that allows for fare capping, where you can sort of pay as you go for a pass. I understand we don't have that capability right this minute, but I hope we'll continue to do that. Is there funding in the capital budget, Mr. Webster, for making progress on that front?
Yes, there is. Yes.
Okay, good. So that's just something I wanted to comment on. I think that I think we want to make sure that in accordance with the principles we adopted last week, that our fare policies are as equitable as possible and that the benefits are accruing to folks on both the rail and the bus side and folks of all different income levels. Thanks very much. That was my questions.
Thank you. And Mr. Webster, can I just follow up on one thing that you said to Ms. Klein there? So the equity proposal, we were talking about this largely in relation to Title VI and the Silver Line service, correct?
Yeah, there is a linkage to yes, the beginning of Silver Line service, and yes, that's correct.
So yeah, well, we were having a lot of those conversations before Ms. Klein joined the board, so I'm not sure if she had that context, but we had put a set aside essentially to provide the level of service we need when we start Silver Line, and I assume that 20 million was what that was. So I just want to be clear on that.
That is correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Let me open it up to the rest of the board. I think I saw Ms. Lowe first. Welcome.
Good morning, thanks. Okay, so I'm doubtless wandering into a conversation that the rest of the board has already been having. So I apologize if I'm asking questions that have already been answered, but I'd like to work backwards through the slides. So looking at slide 38, specifically at the miscellaneous expenses, this just looks like a really big variance, and it's not the biggest variance on the graph here, but I assume what we're dealing with in terms of materials and supplies is related to supply chain issues, and that the personnel bump is probably that our union contracts are tied to the CPI. So that kind of leaves miscellaneous as just standing out there. Could we get some more detail about what that line item covers and why the variance is so high? I don't expect anyone to answer that right now, but if someone does have an answer handy.
We will certainly provide you details about the composition of that particular line item.
That would be great. And then going back to slide 25, this is also probably something that we can't answer right now, but I'm curious to know whether we are we pausing 8000 series railcar acquisition while we wait for the results of the NTSB investigation? Do we anticipate that there could be an issue regarding the 8000 series that based on what we might learn about what's going on with the 7000 series, or are we just right now in terms of budget proceeding with 8000 series acquisition as is?
In terms of budget proceeding, obviously, if we learn anything specific, it's a totally different vendor, for instance. So there's other factors, that may come into play. But clearly, if there were something that is, that none of us foresee that it's not related to the car, that may be something different. But we need to see that play out. But in terms of getting the process moving and keeping that going, yes, we are continuing that.
Okay, well, and that is just helpful that I can brief council and let them know it's different vendor. Okay, and then going all the way back to slide 11, just looking at just even kind of where we were 2 fiscal years ago, and then looking at what we're projecting into the future, joint development just looks, anemic here, and why is that?
Actually, if you look at joint development across the nation, Metro actually is a leader in joint development with respect to transit-oriented development.
But that's a low bar.
Well, it is because Metro doesn't own most of the assets. The jurisdictions own them. But if you look obviously at development around transit stations, obviously, and the amount of revenue those generate, that Metro propels, that's really the high bar. That said, the revenues here are a function of what the agreements that we have, obviously the revenue flows that go through that. And we continue to work, especially in this environment when ridership and fare revenues are declining, to accelerate efforts on joint development and other non-fare revenue options. So we welcome any opportunity to increase our performance in these particular categories, and we collaborate with all of the jurisdictions in terms of making it much more accessible for customers to use transit, to develop around transit facilities, and to generate revenues for both Metro and the region.
Okay, this is a topic that I'd like to return to later, but we can leave it at that for now. And then just big picture, one comment, looking at this budget in terms of framing, it just kind of sounds like we think that the problem that's keeping people off Metro is cost. And I don't think that's what it is. We're talking about fare relief and enticements for the next fiscal year, when really what riders want, what Metro Rail riders want, is fare relief now because of the service disruption. Not next year, and not in the form of a pass, a discounted pass. I think that we need to think bigger in terms of what's keeping people off Metro and what's going to get people back on than just cost. I understand that when you're looking at a budget, that it makes sense that that's the variable that you're looking at. But I think that there's a much bigger kind of perception issue about the relative safety of transit versus other modes, and that people aren't aware of what a great option Metro Rail, Metro Bus, and Metro Access are, and in terms of safety. So I think that as we consider fare options for next year, we have to be realistic about really how powerful a lever that is to pull on.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. I think I saw Chair Smedberg next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dennis, I think this is your, oh no, it's actually Tom's slide 22. And maybe you want to hear from Tom and Dennis on this both. The last bullet there, the dedicated funding supported, by debt. Question for you: the ridership numbers and assumptions that we use, or any other financial assumptions, how is that going to affect debt issuance and things like that moving forward? Is it going to become more expensive for us to do that, given the ridership levels and other assumptions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The debt issuance is tied to the capital program, backed by the dedicated funding revenues, which is, while supported by some sales taxes and other revenues from the jurisdictions, it's not tied to ridership. And so, at least at this time, the market has not indicated to us that transit will be penalized for the loss in ridership, at least for those transactions that are not based on ridership,
Okay.
which is the case for Metro.
Okay, thank you. And then on Dennis, on slide 7, could you give us some of the underlying assumptions that you came up or used to make up that slide?
Yeah.
In other words, specifically, what are you thinking about the federal government coming back? Is that included in any of these assumptions, et cetera?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. So in making up this particular, creating this scenario, we looked at several factors, including federal employment levels and federal employees coming back to the office, as well as the private market. When are folks going to come back to work? What are the surveys telling us about tourism in this region? And some surveys that marketing also conducted. Overall, there seems to be, in the aggregate, tepid expectation of an accelerated return to the office. The federal government is slow. I've not had any clear pronouncements as to when folks are going to come back to the office. The private market is, again, even stepping back in some cases in terms of their expectations of returning to work. And so we've tried, and we also think, based on what we've seen across the nation and sometimes internationally, that there are some folks that will not return to the office ever again. So that's part of the reason, Mr. Chairman, why you see that even by 2025, we are not projecting 100% pre-COVID ridership recovery.
Right. Okay. And when does Silver Line Phase 2 hit in for you for your assumptions here?
Actually, Silver Line Phase 2 hits in the current fiscal year.
The current fiscal, okay.
Right. And we expect full budget for Silver Line Phase 2 in the next fiscal year.
Okay. And one last question, and really just sort of a information point here. On your slide 14, the position restoration.
Yes, sir.
Are those positions related to safety and service reliability, or what are they across the board? Where are those positions?
So they are across the board. There are no safety positions that were frozen.
Okay, that's okay. So the positions that Greg asked about earlier with the MSC, and yeah, okay. And that's primarily that. The 20 million is primarily that. Yeah.
No, sir. The 20 positions that
or the majority of that is, yeah. Sorry.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Smedberg. Mr. Drummer.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chair. So on this same slide, in the spirit of cost savings and cost avoidance in reducing or the growing operating costs. You mentioned the $5 million in savings. Can you give us some insight or some clarity, or specify, if you can, what some of those initiatives are?
Yes, Director Drummond. Most of those, as I think Mr. Whitfield mentioned earlier, almost 70% of Metro's cost is labor, is people, employees. And so most of that will, again, go to people, looking for ways to reduce the employment levels within Metro in order to save money, either through reductions or through freezing those positions. There are some organizational improvements, things that we should not be doing or we'll stop doing. For example, as customers continue to transition to mobile payments, the collection costs and the collection efforts will change, or transition to something totally different. As those occur, we expect to extract savings as much as possible as in that particular environment. But most of this, I have to say, has to be at the end of the day, people.
Okay, thank you. So in that same lane, dealing with continuing management efficiencies, levels of service versus demand and requirements. One of the objectives is, of course, to meet the changing needs, to meet the changing needs of the customers, looking at pre-pandemic, current, FY23, and then, of course, the future. And I'm just wondering, is there a way to include language that not only focuses on increasing ridership and growth, but if the needs of the customers don't change or change and go in a different direction, are we considering in detail how we will respond to that in levels of service? That is a way to achieve efficiencies. You don't have to answer that now, but it's just a consideration. And then my last topic is dealing with risk. Really glad to see that you laid out the risk associated with the FY23 budget. And I would recommend that we add some language that talks about unprogrammed expenditures related to our response to the safety challenges we face today. I'm not wishing that on us in 2023, and hopefully we can have it resolved in 2022, but I think it's important that we at least have some language that addresses it. And that's all I have.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Drummer. I was actually going to ask, and I know it's not a question that they can answer right now, but I was going to specifically mention whether there could be increased costs associated with the 7000 series inspection schedule, for instance, which I think gets to your point. So I would agree with that last comment, given what's happened and what could happen. I just have a couple other questions more related to the fare proposals, if we want to go back to that slide. And actually, one of them is, so these are largely kind of in the same vein as what we did in September. So I'm curious, and again, you may not have this information right now, but for follow-up, how effective were those fare policy changes in September? Did they, in fact, induce some additional ridership over what we were expecting? We did a promotional pass discount, various other things that we did. So was that effective even? And can we sort of learn anything from that to help us guide what we should do in terms of our FY23 proposals? The other thing I'd be interested in seeing is if there are any estimates for ridership impacts from some of these things. Did that, are we anticipating a particular increase in ridership tied to any of these particular proposals, or are there other things out there that we haven't included, that we would want to look at? Obviously, and for the benefit of the committee, the board can indicate interest in other fare policy changes that we would put out for potentially public hearing. And so, this is the general manager's proposal. It doesn't have to be the only things that we look at. And it's our job, if we have other things that we want to look at, and at least get, some staff work done on, and get public comment on to identify those things here in the first part of this process so that we can do those. And so just process wise, what's sort of the timeline for those things, do you think? If we want to sort of put our own ideas on the table, how should we do that? And when should we work with you on that?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, before Tom and Dennis answer that part of your question, I think in terms of things that we've done and the impact when those things are done, I think we have to be cautious because if this was a pre-pandemic and we started to do some of these things, it may be a little bit more linear, but there's so many variables right now that are impacting people's trips. So we can gather numbers for you, but I would, again, just caution that it's because we did this, that happened. Just because right now the market is just so unknown to us. That's the only caution I would have that. But we can get you some numbers of what's happened on ridership when we instituted this. I can tell you a weekend, obviously the ridership has increased a bit. But again, is that as much people are traveling different then versus what they did during the week? Just sort of an aside, we were having very busy Fridays, and historically Wednesday was our busiest day. And Friday, was not. So, I mean, again, that's the travel market changing around us. And in terms of the process, in terms of adding other initiatives, Tom or Dennis, can you talk to that?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think with respect to the timeline for board members to identify initiatives, obviously the sooner the better, but Jennifer has controls the calendar with respect to the docket activities. So to the extent that we get it early, we can certainly do the appropriate analysis and provide responses to you and to the board members prior to finalization of the docket.
So Jennifer, I mean, I assume we're going to have further discussion at the Finance Committee on this budget, but do we want to sort of lay out a timeline or a process? Or have that discussion at least soon with the board to help us understand that?
Sure. Typically, if there is a need for public hearings, a docket is approved in December so that staff can then be preparing all the materials to meet all the requisite deadlines for publication and opening of the public comment period in January to then close sometime in February to give the board time to adopt the budget by March. That's the typical overview of the budget process. So depending on what other additional items the board may want to see on that docket, we would still request that those ideas be formulated potentially this month so that we can still proceed on that same timeline.
Great. Thank you. Okay, are there any other sort of burning questions that popped in someone's head that you didn't get to ask so far? All right, seeing none then, with no further business to come before the Finance Committee today, we stand adjourned, and I will turn the floor back over to Chairman Smedberg.
Thank you, Mr. Letourneau. I'd like to request for executive session in accordance with the bylaws. I, Paul Smedberg, request that the Board of Directors convene an executive session to discuss the following matters pursuant to Article 2, Paragraph 9, subsections A, budgetary matters that may affect legal positions, WMATA contracts, or sensitive relationships with local jurisdictions or the federal government, and C, personnel or labor issues involving discussions of labor contracts and labor negotiations, consideration or interview of candidates for employment, and the assignment, appointment, promotion, demotion, or resignation of individuals, and F, safety and security matters where premature release would compromise public safety. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Deputy Mayor Babers. All in favor? Aye. Any
Aye.
opposed?
Aye.
The ayes have it. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next week.